Well, this is the final session for this week. It's been a great privilege and a joy to share these thoughts with you. And I hope that you've been blessed by having your mind stimulated and your hearts warmed. And so on this subject of living in the grace of God, so far we've seen that, number one, we have access into this grace by faith. Romans 5 and verse 2, that's where we start. And that is why many people can't start, because they feel that they must somehow do something to deserve things from God. But grace is received by faith. And without faith, we can make no progress, because without faith, it is impossible to please God. And then we saw the second thing is that from the fullness of his grace, we receive one blessing after another. That's in John 1 and verse 16. And blessing is dispensed as an act of God's grace, not because it's deserved. And there's always more of his grace to explore and to enjoy. So now I want us to go a little further with this lovely theme in the Word of God. And I know we won't have time to explore all the wonders of living in the grace of God, but we will finish with this one for now. And the third point I want to make is this, and it's found in Hebrews 12 and verse 15, where it says, "See to it that no one falls short or misses the grace of God." How can we miss the grace of God? Well, we can miss the grace of God by withdrawing into the safety of the law, where we choose to live not by faith in what God has done, by accepting his forgiveness and favor, although we don't deserve it, but by the observance of rules and reward for effort. Now, there's a terrible danger in going back to reliance on the law, because Galatians 2 and verse 16 says that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. And Romans 6 and verse 14 reminds us that you are not under law, but under grace. In fact, look at what Galatians 5 and verse 4 tells us if we go back to the law. It says, "You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace." Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've fallen away from your salvation, but by relying on the law, you have taken a definite backward step in the journey of faith. Why? Because Hebrews 7 and verse 19 makes it very clear that the law made nothing perfect. It was unable to bring anything to completion. It was entirely unable to finish the task. Romans 8 and verse 3 tells us, "For what the law was powerless to do, in that it was weakened by the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering." And when Jesus hung on the cross, he cried out not in despair, but in triumph, "It is finished." You see, the law was unable to bring the work of salvation to completion, but grace, God's unmerited favor, cried out in that one supreme act of redemption, "It is finished." There's no more for you to do. There's just something for you to believe and to receive. Now, we saw the last time that God is able to make all grace abound to us because of his position and his power as our Father. But we have to be willing to receive it, again by faith and not by our effort. Now, let me just sound a note of caution here. Grace is not a license to do just what we like. Because of God's grace, he gives us the ability to do what he likes, not on the basis of struggle, but on the basis of relationship through our new nature. There is a terrific contrast between law and grace, and the scripture never mingles these two principles. Law always has a place and a work distinct and wholly diverse from that of grace. So, for example, law is God prohibiting and requiring. Grace is God beseeching and bestowing. Law is a ministry of condemnation. Grace is a ministry of forgiveness. Law curses. Grace redeems us from the curse. Law kills. Grace makes alive. Law puts a great and guilty distance between people and God. Grace brings guilty people near to God. Law says, hate your enemy. Grace says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Law says, do and live. Grace says, believe and live. Law utterly condemns the best person. Grace freely justifies the worst person. Law is a system of probation. Grace is a system of favor. Law stones an adulteress. Grace says, neither do I condemn you. And the thing that absolutely blows my mind is this. Under law, the sheep dies for the shepherd. But under grace, the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now, what was that about amazing grace? You see, when we truly understand the greatness of the grace of God, we realize that we can't go back to the law, and we can't risk alienation from Christ. We alienate ourselves or cut ourselves off from Christ when we try to gain justification by the things that we do rather than by what he has done. It takes us back to us again and reward for our performance. But I'll say it again, God does not accept us on the basis of our performance, but on the basis of Jesus' performance on our behalf. But what's our attitude to that? There are some strange teachings today, as if because of grace, there's no problem about us continuing in sin. But actually, the exact opposite is true. In Titus 2, verses 11 and 12, it says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people." It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright and godly lives in this present age. Also, look at Jude and verse 4. It says, "For certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago have secretly slipped in among you. They are ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into a license for immorality, and they deny Jesus Christ, our only sovereign and Lord." The New Living Translation says, "Some ungodly people have wormed their way into your churches, saying that God's marvelous grace allows us to live immoral lives." Grace cannot excuse or benefit the Christian continuing in sin. Actually, Paul comes up with a statement in Romans 6, verses 1 to 2, and he says, "What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means." The King James Version says, "God forbid. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer?" You see, we died to that environment. If we go back to it now, our new life will not be able to survive. And this is what we soon realize as Christians. No matter how many times we repeat the mantra, "There's no harm in this, there's no harm in that," maybe not to our natural life, but our spiritual life begins to suffer. And we need to understand that the thoughts and the words and the deeds that are out of character with Jesus Christ are actually toxic to the life of the Spirit. Oh yes, we all began in that atmosphere and we survived, even thrived. Now let's take an example from nature. Some animals go through stages in their lives that include a stage called metamorphosis. A dictionary definition of metamorphosis is a marked change in appearance, character, condition or function, a transformation, or a change in the form and habits of an animal during normal development after the embryonic stage. So in amphibians, we see the changing of a tadpole into a frog. In insects, we see the transformation of a maggot into an adult fly and a caterpillar into a butterfly. And I like the story of two caterpillars who were walking along together when a beautiful butterfly glides overhead. And one caterpillar turns to the other and says, "You'll never get me up in one of those things." Well, little did he know. Now, metamorphosis is an interesting process. It involves a change in the structure of particular body tissues. In other words, the former life comes to an end and a completely new life begins. Now, does that sound familiar? We read in Romans 6 and verse 2 that we are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? During metamorphosis, there's a change in the form of life and the habits of the creature. There's a marked change in the appearance, the character and condition. It's no longer the same, and the old rules of life no longer apply. The Apostle Paul gives very clear instruction to the Christians at Rome when he writes in Romans 12 and verse 2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." The New Living Translation says, "Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think." The word translated as transform is the Greek word metamorpho, and it carries the same thought as metamorphosis, where we are not only changed from the inside, but we actually die to the old life. Now in nature, going back to the old environment and the old habits after metamorphosis would be fatal to the new life. And here I like to use the example of a dragonfly. Dragonflies lay their eggs in water, sometimes attached to plant stems. The eggs eventually hatch into larvae called nymphs, which mature in the water, feeding on various forms of aquatic life, like even small fish. And their natural environment is the water. They don't breathe air. In that stage of life, in that environment, in that condition, the nymphs can molt between 5 and 14 times, and they live in that environment of water for up to 5 years, depending on conditions. Then, when the nymphs are fully matured, they leave the water and undergo metamorphosis into the adult form. They effectively die to their old life, and new life begins. They can now breathe air. They can fly. Their diet changes. Their future is so different. Now, after that metamorphosis, they still live near to the water, and they still have to use the water for drinking, for laying their eggs. But if they decided to make that their normal environment again, they would drown. You see, through metamorphosis, they have been transformed. And part of the result of that transformation is the necessary change of environment. What was normal for the old life is no longer able to sustain the new life. They used to be swimmers, now they're flyers. And there's no sadder sight than to see a dragonfly that has become trapped in water again, struggling for survival. Well, no sadder sight that is, apart from a person who once knew the realities of living in the grace of God, being trapped in the foul water of the old life once again. The spiritual vitality begins to ebb away. The joy turns to misery. It becomes harder to breathe, and something within us begins to die. Now we know that even as Christians, we still live in the world. We have to use the things of the world, like its roads, its banks, its shops, etc. Jesus actually said that we are in the world, but we're not of the world. And we cannot live by worldly principles, worldly priorities, and worldly standards any longer. And we're told to see to it that no one misses the grace of God or misses out on the benefits of living in that grace. Grace brings about the metamorphosis where we are dead to sin, dead to the law, and it enables us to live in the environment of the Lordship of Jesus Christ. So don't get trapped in the water again. You're no longer equipped to survive there. We died to that old water of sin. How can we live in it any longer? Well, this week, I hope we've been able to appreciate all that God has already made available to us. And about living in the grace of God, we've learned that we have access into grace by faith. Out of the fullness of his grace, God has given us one blessing after another. And all that we have to do is to make sure that no one falls short or misses the grace of God. So let's determine to live in the grace of God day by day, remembering that God does not accept us on the basis of our performance, but on the basis of Jesus' performance in our behalf. Well, we've run out of time. Maybe if the lockdown continues for some time, we'll pick up on this beautiful theme at some future date. Until then, please live out the teaching. We began this week by considering the reservoir of God's blessing. We referred to the river flowing from the temple. And the Bible uses other aquatic imagery about wells, springs, fountains, oceans. So I'm going to leave you with a song. You can click on the next post if you want to hear it. The song is "There is a river that never shall run dry." So be blessed. Be nice to people. Be a blessing to everyone you meet. I miss you. I love you all. Hope to see you soon. God bless. Bye.